Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
Sometimes stories arrive softly, the way twilight folds into night, with no clear beginning and no certain end. This one begins with a boy, Morty, lying awake when the world around him should have been asleep. His room was quiet, but his mind was not. There was a restlessness inside him, a wish that pressed against his chest like a secret too heavy to keep. He didn't quite understand it, couldn't put it into words, but it was there like a candle flickering in the dark, small but stubborn, and that night, when the stars seemed unusually bright, he wondered if they were listening. It wasn't the first time Morty had felt the need to ask for something more. From the outside, his life seemed ordinary enough, a family that stumbled through its own imperfections, a school filled with noise and laughter and the occasional cruelty, and a home where silence was both comfort and weight. But Morty carried inside him a soft ache, a longing not for riches or fame but for clarity, an answer to something he could never quite define. Children are often said to be dreamers, yet Morty's dreams were not always playful. They were questions dressed as fantasies, hopes disguised as adventures. On that night, the wish rose within him more clearly than before. He wanted help, not the kind of help that comes with homework or chores, but help with being himself, help with the confusing edges of growing up, with the weight of small mistakes, with the uncertainty of who he might become. He thought in his own stumbling way that if he could ask the universe for just a little guidance, maybe it would answer. He turned his head toward the window, where the sky stretched vast and endless, and whispered something into the dark. The words were fragile, uncertain, more like a breath than a command, but they left his lips all the same, drifting upward as though carried on a current unseen. The room stayed still, the house breathing its nighttime rhythm, the hum of pipes, the creak of wood, the muffled sigh of someone turning in their sleep. Yet Morty felt a strange sensation linger, as if the air itself had paused to listen. He clutched his blanket closer, unsure if what he felt was real or simply the imagination of a tired mind. Still, the thought refused to leave him, that the stars above might have heard, and that perhaps they would answer in their own time. Morning did not bring clarity, only the soft confusion of a boy carrying a wish he didn't know how to name. He dressed slowly, his mind caught between ordinary tasks and extraordinary questions. At breakfast, the clatter of dishes and the blur of voices swirled around him. His mother asked about school, his father mumbled about cereal, his sister rolled her eyes at everything. Morty sat there quietly, half present, the wish still glowing faintly inside him, like an ember that refused to fade. No one noticed it, and perhaps no one could. After all, wishes of this kind live too deep for the world to see. As the days stretched on, Morty tried to forget. He went to school. He laughed at jokes that weren't very funny. He walked home under skies that changed from gold to gray. But every so often, in the quiet spaces between moments, he remembered the way the stars had felt that night, like companions in silence. He remembered his whisper, and wondered if it had reached anything beyond his window. And though no answer came, he carried a strange kind of hope, a belief that perhaps something unseen was waiting to respond. It was on one such evening, when the air was heavy with the scent of rain, that Morty stumbled upon something unusual. His grandfather, Rick, had left one of his many strange inventions unattended on the workbench in the garage. Normally, Morty would have hurried past, too cautious of Rick's warnings and too wary of the man's unpredictable creations. But tonight, curiosity tugged at him more insistently. The device sat there, small and unassuming, almost like a forgotten toy. A simple box, smooth on its surface, with a button that seemed to pulse faintly as though it had its own heartbeat. Morty hesitated, the memory of his wish rising again like a tide. He didn't reach for the box immediately. Instead, he stood still, watching it, as though waiting for the object itself to speak. There was something about its presence that felt oddly familiar, though he knew he had never seen it before. The pulsing light seemed to sync with his own breath, slow and steady, calming rather than alarming. And in that moment, a thought crept into him. Could this be the answer the stars had sent? The idea was foolish, and he knew it. Rick's inventions rarely carried comfort. They were dangerous, unpredictable, often chaotic. Yet, Morty felt no fear, only a quiet wonder, as though the box was not an invention at all, but a message. He reached out, his fingers trembling not from dread, but from the soft electricity of anticipation. The surface was cool to the touch, smoother than glass, warmer than metal. He traced the outline of the button, but didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, he let the weight of the moment sink into him. There are times in life when we feel the world turning, and an unseen hand shifts the air around us. Morty, in his small garage with the scent of rain clinging to the air, felt exactly that. He thought of his wish, the whisper beneath the stars, and wondered if this was how answers arrived, not with trumpets or thunder, but with quiet invitations. A box. A button. A choice. He stepped back uncertain, heart caught between hesitation and yearning. The garage was silent, the house beyond it asleep. Outside, drops of rain began to fall, soft and steady, tapping against the roof like a lullaby. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sound. It was calming, steady, the kind of rhythm that made the world feel smaller and kinder. When he opened them again, the box was still there, waiting, patient. And so, the night that began with a whispered wish now carried Morty closer to something he couldn't name but could feel deep within, the gentle pull of destiny, quiet and unhurried. The story had begun not with a grand entrance, but with a boy, a star, and a silent box that waited to be touched. Morty stood there for a long while, his hand hovering over the strange box as though the slightest movement might wake it from sleep. The garage around him was filled with Rick's clutter, half-finished machines, empty bottles, wires that hummed faintly with hidden energy, but none of it seemed to matter. The box had a presence of its own, quiet yet magnetic, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The rain outside continued its soft percussion, drops sliding down the window, blurring the shapes of the world beyond. It felt like the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what the boy would do. He thought of his whisper to the stars, the one he wasn't even sure they had heard. Maybe this was coincidence. Maybe just another one of Rick's experiments left behind without care. But something in Morty's heart told him otherwise. It didn't feel random. It felt chosen, as though the wish he had carried so quietly had been answered in a form he never expected. He thought about the weight of his longing, how often he felt invisible in his own life, how he wished someone or something would guide him, even in the smallest of ways. And here was the box, silent but waiting. His fingers brushed the button again, lighter this time, almost like a greeting. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, a slow rhythm that matched the faint glow beneath the surface. But he didn't press it. Not yet. He was only a boy, and boys often hesitate when the world opens itself too suddenly. Instead, Morty stepped back, wrapped his arms around himself, and tried to imagine what might happen if he did press it. He pictured light, sound, voices from nowhere. He pictured something answering him, not cruelly, but gently, like the stars themselves bending low to respond. At dinner that night, the wish still hummed inside him. The table was set as it always was, plates placed a little unevenly, silverware mismatched, conversation stumbling in the way of families who try and fail to connect. His father rambled about work. His mother's eyes were distant with thoughts she didn't share, and his sister's impatience spilled into sighs and sharp glances. Morty sat quietly, pushing food around his plate, and wondered how it would feel to ask them for help. But he knew the truth. They loved him, yes, but they didn't always understand him. His wish was too deep, too strange to explain. That was why he had whispered to the stars instead. Later, when the house had fallen into its nighttime silence, Morty crept back to the garage. He carried a flashlight. Though he hardly needed it, the box seemed to glow faintly, a soft blue that guided him through the shadows. He sat on the cold floor, cross-legged like a child at story time, and stared at it. The garage smelled faintly of oil and dust, and yet in this quiet, it felt sacred, as though he had stepped into a place outside of time. His breath fogged in the cool air, and with every inhale, he felt closer to something he couldn't explain. "Are you for me?" he whispered, his voice trembling in the stillness. He knew it was foolish to speak aloud to a machine, but there was comfort in saying the words. "Did you come from them?" He glanced toward the ceiling, toward the stars hidden beyond the roof. The box remained silent, its light pulsing steadily, but Morty swore it seemed to be listening. Finally, with a mix of fear and hope, he reached forward and pressed the button. The sound was not what he expected. There was no explosion, no wild burst of energy. Instead, there was a soft chime, almost musical, like the opening note of a lullaby. The air shimmered faintly, as though someone had brushed a curtain of light across the room. And then, from within the box, a figure emerged, tall, blue, with a face that was both strange and oddly kind. The being stretched upward, blinking as though it had just woken from a long sleep, and then bowed slightly toward Morty. "I am here to help," the figure said, its voice gentle, almost serene. Morty froze, his heart racing, but not from fear. There was something calming in the presence of the being, as though it carried with it the same stillness he had felt beneath the stars. For a long moment, Morty could only stare. He had expected something mechanical, cold, perhaps even dangerous. But this was different. The blue figure seemed alive, its gaze steady but warm, its posture patient, waiting for him to speak. Morty's throat tightened as he remembered his wish, the quiet plea he had whispered into the night. Could it really be that the universe had answered? Morty's voice cracked and he swallowed. I just wanted help. The figure tilted its head, a soft smile forming on its face. Then that is what I will give. Morty felt tears prick his eyes, though he didn't understand why. Perhaps it was relief, perhaps disbelief, or perhaps it was the simple wonder of being heard, of being answered when he had expected silence. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch, but simply to bridge the space between them, and the figure leaned closer, nodding as though to say, "Yes, I understand." The rain outside had stopped, leaving the night hushed and clear. Through the garage window, stars peeked through the thinning clouds, glittering softly. Morty glanced at them, then back at the figure, and realized something quietly profound. The stars had not spoken directly, they had sent this instead. This strange, gentle companion, born from a box yet carrying something far greater than wires or circuits. In that moment, Morty no longer felt invisible. He no longer felt small. He felt for the first time in a long while that the universe had seen him. And though he did not know where this new path would lead, he felt ready to follow, step by step, guided not by fear but by quiet wonder. The blue figure stood quietly before Morty, tall and calm, its very presence reshaping the air around the garage. For a moment it felt as though the walls themselves were listening, leaning in with patient silence. Morty's breath slowed, his fear dissolving into something gentler, an awe that pressed softly at his chest. He had expected chaos, sparks, some unpredictable outburst, like every other one of Rick's creations. But this was different. The figure was not wild. It was serene, steady, waiting for him in a way no one else ever had. "I'm here to help," it repeated, voice like a soft echo that lingered even after the words had fallen quiet. Morty shifted his weight nervously, fingers brushing against the edge of his shirt. The words seemed so simple, yet they carried more weight than any promise he had heard before. He thought of his wish, whispered to the stars, and how impossible it seemed that anyone or anything had actually heard. Yet here was the answer, standing in front of him, glowing faintly like starlight made flesh. He wanted to speak to ask 100 questions, but the words tangled in his throat. Finally, he managed a shaky breath. What kind of help?" The figure tilted its head, blinking once, slowly. "The help you need," it said, as if the meaning should be clear. Its expression was patient, its posture unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world to wait for Morty to find the right words. Morty hesitated. The truth was, he wasn't even sure what he needed. His life felt like a puzzle, where the pieces never quite fit, where every corner left him pressing harder than he should, only to find emptiness between the edges. How could he explain that to something born of a box? How could he ask for help when he didn't know how to name the ache inside him? He looked down at his shoes, at the scuffed toes and untied laces, and whispered, "I don't know." The figure stepped closer, but gently, its movement slow and deliberate, like a tide rolling toward shore. It knelt, lowering itself so its gaze was level with Morty's. Its eyes were round and strangely human, filled with a calm light. "That's all right," it said softly. "Not knowing is where we begin." Morty felt his throat tighten again. No one had ever said that to him before. Usually when he admitted uncertainty, it was met with impatience or dismissal. But here in the quiet garage, with rain-washed stars outside and the hum of silence all around, he felt understood. He nodded faintly, unsure what else to do. The figure straightened again, standing tall but not intimidating, and gestured lightly with its long hand. "You may ask me for anything. Try." Morty's heart quickened. The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. He thought of asking for something grand, something impossible, but the thought felt too heavy, too far from the boy he really was. Instead, his eyes darted to the corner of the garage, where an old dartboard hung crooked on the wall. Rick had put it there ages ago, but Morty had never managed to hit the center. No matter how he tried, his throws always curved wrong, always landed clumsily at the edges. It seemed silly, but the memory of those failures burned faintly in his chest.
"Could you help me with that?"
he asked, quietly pointing toward the board. The figure followed his gaze, then nodded once. "Of course!" Morty picked up one of the dusty darts, his fingers trembling as he held it. He aimed carefully, but his arm felt uncertain, awkward. The figure stepped behind him, close enough for Morty to feel its calm presence at his back. It didn't touch him. Not quite, but Morty felt a warmth, like a guiding energy wrapping around his shoulders. "Breathe," it murmured. Morty inhaled slowly, the air cool and grounding in his lungs. "Now release." The dart flew. It landed close to the center, closer than Morty had ever managed before. His eyes widened, a smile tugging at his lips. The figure simply nodded, as though this was no great miracle but an ordinary kindness. Again it said, "They tried once more, and then again." Each time, Morty grew steadier, more confident. He wasn't perfect, but he was improving, and for the first time in a long time, the improvement felt like enough. He laughed under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. Wow, I didn't think I could do it. The figure's eyes softened. You only needed someone to believe you could. Morty froze at those words, because deep down, he knew they were true. More than skill, more than guidance, what he had always longed for was belief, not from his teachers, who overlooked him, nor from his family, who often dismissed him, nor even from Rick, whose sharp genius left little room for gentleness. What Morty craved was the quiet assurance that he was capable, even when he doubted himself, and now, somehow, he had found it in the most unlikely place, a strange blue companion summoned from a box. They spent the rest of the night practicing small things, dart throws, balancing objects, even holding his breath long enough to steady his nerves. Each task was met with patient guidance, no judgment, only encouragement. Morty felt lighter, as though some unseen burden had been eased from his shoulders. The hours slipped by, measured only by the quiet ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the house. Eventually, the figure lowered itself again, folding long limbs with care. "You see," it said softly, "help does not always mean answers. Sometimes it is simply standing beside you until you remember what you can do." Morty nodded, eyes heavy with both wonder and weariness. He yawned, and for the first time in weeks, the thought of sleep didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a comfort. The figure watched him carefully, then gave a small bow. "When you are ready, you may call on me again." Morty blinked. "You mean you'll come back?" "I was made to help," it said simply, "and I will until you no longer need me." Morty's chest warmed at the words. He didn't understand how long that promise might last or what it truly meant, but he clung to it all the same. With a sleepy smile, he whispered, "Thank you." The figure's expression softened into something that could almost be called affection. "Rest now, Morty. The stars are watching." Morty's eyes drifted shut as he leaned back against the wall, the faint blue glow wrapping around him like a lullaby, and for the first time in a long time, he slept without the ache of loneliness pressing against his chest, knowing that his whispered wish had been answered, not with grandeur, but with quiet, steady presence. When Morty woke the next morning, sunlight spilled through his blinds in thin golden lines, the kind that made dust float like tiny stars caught in the air. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the night before had been a dream. The dartboard on the garage wall, the glowing box, the calm blue figure, all of it seemed too strange, too gentle to be real. But when he rubbed his eyes and sat up, he felt the echo of it inside him, the way one remembers a lullaby even after the music fades. His chest felt lighter, steadier, as though someone had tucked belief itself beneath his ribs while he slept. Downstairs, the house carried on as usual. His father was flipping through a newspaper without really reading, muttering about bills. His sister argued with their mother over something small that seemed enormous in the morning light. Morty sat at the table quietly, chewing his cereal, and though no one noticed, he was different. He held a secret now, something fragile but alive, something that gave the day a softer glow. He kept glancing at the garage door, wondering if the figure still waited there, patient as before. That evening, when the house grew hushed again, Morty returned. The garage greeted him with its familiar scent of oil and dust, but now it felt less like a place of clutter and more like a sanctuary. The box sat exactly where he had left it, still pulsing with that steady blue light, and when Morty stepped closer, it responded, as though sensing him. With a quiet hum, the light grew brighter, and from it, the blue figure unfolded once more, stretching tall as if waking from another long slumber. "I wondered if you would return," it said, voice low and calm, filling the space without pressing too hard. Morty smiled nervously, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Yeah, I wanted to see you again." The figure inclined its head, eyes warm with recognition. "Then I am here." Morty felt a strange relief wash over him, like stepping back into a room where you are always welcome. This time, though, he wasn't content just to test small skills. His mind carried questions about himself, about the figure, about the box, and the wish that had brought it all to life. Yet the words tangled, shy and hesitant. He looked at the floor, tracing invisible shapes with the toe of his shoe. The figure seemed to understand without being told. "You do not need to hurry," it murmured. The heart unfolds slowly. They sat together on the cold floor of the garage, Morty with his knees pulled up to his chest, the figure cross-legged with ease, its limbs folding like flowing cloth. Silence lingered, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that held space, like a meadow waiting for wind. Morty felt safe in it, safe enough that eventually his thoughts spilled out in fragments. Sometimes I don't think I'm enough. Like I'm always messing things up, like I'm not good at being me. The figure listened, head tilted gently, its glowing eyes steady. When Morty's voice faltered, it spoke softly. Perfection is not the point of living. The point is to learn how to carry yourself kindly even when you stumble. Morty blinked at the words, letting them sink in. They felt true in a way he hadn't considered before. He thought about school, about the way mistakes seemed to brand him, about the way his sister's sharp comments or his father's absent-minded sighs cut deeper than they were meant to. But hearing this from something that felt like it had been born out of his very wish eased the sting. "Could you remind me?" he asked quietly. "Like whenever I forget?" The figure gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That is why I exist." The days that followed became a quiet rhythm. Morty would go through his routine, school, family dinners, the blur of daily life, but each evening he returned to the garage. Sometimes they practiced little things, just as before. Darts, balance, timing. Other times they simply sat and talked. Morty spoke of his fears, his dreams, the small embarrassments that clung to him long after they had passed. The figure listened without judgment, responding not with lectures but with gentle phrases that soothed like cool water on a burn. And slowly Morty began to change. His shoulders didn't slump quite as much when he walked down the school hallway. His voice held a little more steadiness when he spoke up in class. Even at home, where chaos was constant, he carried himself with a quiet strength, as though some hidden hand was always at his back. No one noticed the cause, but the difference was there, subtle as a shift in weather. One night, as Morty lay on the garage floor staring at the ceiling, he whispered, "You're kinda like a friend." The figure tilted its head. "Is that what you wish me to be?" Morty thought about it. The word felt too small, too ordinary for what the figure truly was. It was more than a friend, more than a guide. It was like a reflection of the very wish he had carried inside, a living reminder that he was not alone. Still, he smiled softly and nodded. "Yeah, a friend. The figure placed its hand lightly against its chest, bowing its head. "Then I am honored." Morty laughed under his breath, the sound quiet but genuine. And as he did, the garage seemed to shift again, not in sight or structure, but in spirit. What had once been a cluttered workshop had become something else entirely. It was now a space of trust, of wonder, of beginnings. Outside, the stars shone clear, their light spilling faintly through the windows. Morty thought of the night he had first whispered to them, how small and foolish that wish had felt. And yet, here he was, sitting beside the impossible proof that even the quietest prayers could echo back in unexpected ways. He let out a long breath, a sigh that carried both relief and quiet awe, and whispered, "Thank you." The figure inclined its head again, as steady as always. "You are welcome, Morty. Always." And though the night deepened around them, Morty felt no fear of the dark. He felt only the calm weight of presence, the comfort of knowing that somewhere between the stars and the silence, his wish had been heard and answered in the form of a blue companion who would stay until he no longer needed the reminder. Morty didn't notice at first how the nights in the garage began to stretch longer, how each moment with the figure blurred into the next like ripples folding across water. What had started as curiosity, a fragile experiment with the unknown, was becoming something deeper. It was no longer about the darts on the wall or the balance tricks. It was about the quiet conversations, the way the figure's words echoed long after Morty had left. He carried them like invisible lanterns, small flickers of light guiding him through hallways, classrooms, and family dinners. But something else began to stir beneath that comfort, something he couldn't quite name. It was subtle at first, an ache in the space between questions and answers, a sense that what he had called a friend might be something more complicated. The figure had no name, no past, no world outside the glow of the box. It existed only when Morty was near, shaped by his wish, his longing. That realization grew inside him, slow and heavy, until he found himself wondering, was it real at all, or just a reflection of himself too kind to admit it? One evening, Morty entered the garage with that question pressing against his chest. The figure was already waiting, unfolding from the light with its usual grace, eyes warm as if it had been listening, even before he spoke. Morty sat cross-legged, picking at the loose thread of his sleeve, until finally the words tumbled out. Do you exist when I'm not here?" The figure tilted its head, and the silence stretched long enough for Morty to feel his stomach twist. Finally it answered, voice calm but layered with something Morty couldn't quite read. "I exist where you believe me to exist. When you leave, I return to that belief. When you call, I return to you. The answer was both comforting and unsettling. Morty wanted it to be simple, wanted the figure to say yes, to claim a life beyond his presence, but instead it placed the responsibility back into his hands, making him realize how much of this was tethered to his own heart. So, if I stop believing, you'd vanish? His voice cracked on the last word, the thought tasting bitter. The figure's glow softened. If you no longer need me, I will rest. But that does not mean I was never real. Reality is not only what the eye sees, it is also what the soul remembers. Morty swallowed hard. The words rang with a kind of wisdom that scared him, because they implied an ending he wasn't ready to imagine. He had only just begun to feel whole again, to stand taller in a world that always seemed too big for him. To lose this now felt unthinkable. For days, the thought haunted him. At school, he stared at the board, while the teacher's words blurred into meaningless sound. At home, he half listened to arguments or television chatter, distracted by the echo of the figure's voice. He couldn't decide whether the comfort he felt was a gift, or a fragile illusion that might collapse the moment he doubted too much. One night, unable to hold it in, he whispered to the stars again. The same way he had on that first night. Please don't take it away, not yet. I'm not ready. His voice cracked, but the plea carried something raw and honest, floating into the dark as though the sky itself might cradle it. When he returned to the garage, the figure was already waiting, but this time, there was a weight to its presence, as though it had heard that plea and carried it like a shadow. Morty sat down quickly, almost desperate, blurting out the fear that had followed him all week. What if you leave? What if one day you're just gone and I can't call you back? What happens to me then? The figure leaned forward, its gaze steady, and for the first time Morty thought he glimpsed something like sorrow within that endless calm. Then you will carry what we have built inside yourself. Every word, every moment, it will not leave you. You will still stumble, still hurt, but you will not be the same boy who first whispered to the stars. You will have learned how to stand with yourself. Morty shook his head, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. But I don't want to do it alone. Alone does not mean empty, the figure said gently. Even if I fade, the part of me that matters stays. You are already carrying it. You just do not see it yet. The words stung because they were true, and Morty hated how much truth always hurt before it healed. He buried his face in his hands, wishing the garage could fold around him like a cocoon, wishing time would stop so he wouldn't have to face the moment the figure might disappear. And yet, beneath the ache, he felt something shifting, a seed of strength pushing against the soil. The figure had been right before. Perfection wasn't the point. And maybe permanence wasn't either. Maybe what mattered was what he became in the presence of something he once thought impossible. That night, when Morty finally lifted his head, his eyes red but clear, he asked softly, "Will you stay until I'm ready?" The figure reached out, placing a hand over his chest, where his heartbeat fluttered quick and fragile. "I will stay as long as you need. But remember, Morty, being ready is not an end. It is a beginning." Morty exhaled, the words pressing deep into him, sinking where fear had been. For the first time, he realized that needing the figure didn't make him weak. It was part of growing, of learning, and when the day came that he no longer needed it, it wouldn't be a loss. It would be proof that the wish he had whispered had already fulfilled itself. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the glow that surrounded his companion, and for the first time he didn't fear the silence that might come after. He only felt grateful for the present, for the simple fact that he had been heard, and that the answer had come in the form of a friend who would stay until his heart learned how to carry the light on its own. The garage grew quiet, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed with something alive, something both fragile and infinite, something that whispered to Morty that he was changing, step by step, into someone who could stand in the world not because he had no fear, but because he had learned to hold it gently. The following morning arrived in quiet shades of pale gold, and Morty woke with the strange sense that something inside him had shifted during the night. The fear that had weighed so heavily on him had softened, not vanished, but gentled into something he could carry. He remembered the figure's hand over his chest, the steady assurance that being ready was not an end, but a beginning. That thought lingered in him like a soft hum, following him into the day. At school, the difference showed in small, almost imperceptible ways. He raised his hand once in class, not because he was certain of the answer, but because he no longer felt crushed by the possibility of being wrong. When the other students snickered, as they often did, their voices didn't slice as deep. He still flinched, but he recovered faster, as if there was a quiet hand on his shoulder reminding him that worth was not measured by their approval. Yet growth, Morty was beginning to understand, rarely came without test. It arrived when he least expected it, in a moment so ordinary it almost slipped past unnoticed. He was standing in the lunch line, tray balanced awkwardly, when he saw a boy near the back of the cafeteria drop his food. The boy froze, staring at the mess on the floor while laughter bubbled around him. It was the kind of scene Morty knew too well, the sting of humiliation sharp and familiar. He felt the old instinct to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen, to preserve his own fragile invisibility. But then another thought rose, slow but steady, echoing like the figure's voice inside him. Small acts carry weight. You don't have to fix the world. Just be present. Before he could second guess, Morty stepped forward. He crouched down, picked up the spilled tray, and handed it back with a small, awkward smile. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and for a flicker of a moment, Morty saw gratitude soften his expression. The laughter around them dimmed, not silenced, but interrupted, as if people realized the moment wasn't so funny after all. Morty's heart hammered in his chest, but he walked away steady, tray still in hand. His steps felt different, like each one carried more weight than it had before. Not the weight of fear, but the weight of choosing to act. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was his, and it mattered. The night in the garage, Morty told the figure about it, recounting the scene with nervous energy. I don't know why I did it. I just couldn't let him sit there, you know? I didn't fix anything big, but it felt good, like maybe it meant something. The figure listened, eyes luminous with quiet pride. It did mean something. Meaning does not live in scale, Morty. A whisper can steady someone more than a shout. A hand on the floor can lift more than a crown on a head. Do not measure by size. Measure by heart. Morty's chest warmed at the words, a glow of affirmation that reached deeper than any applause could have. He realized then that what the figure gave him wasn't just comfort, it was a mirror, showing him the strength he didn't believe he had until he acted upon it. But growth was not without its shadows. As days passed, Morty found himself caught between two worlds, the outer world of school, family, and noise, and the inner one of the garage where wisdom unfolded like a lullaby. The contrast grew sharper. In the garage, he felt whole, seen. Outside, he still stumbled, still fought to keep that strength alive. It reached a breaking point one evening at dinner. His parents argued, voices bouncing off the walls, sharp and unrelenting. Morty sat there, shrinking smaller and smaller, until suddenly he heard himself speak. Quiet but firm. Can we just stop for a second, please? The table froze. His parents blinked at him, surprised. Not because his words were loud, but because they carried a steadiness that neither expected. The argument fizzled into silence. Awkward and fragile, but real. Morty stared at his plate, not daring to lift his eyes, heart racing as if he had leapt into unknown waters. Later that night, he told the figure about it, unsure whether he had done the right thing. I didn't mean to. It just came out, and they stopped. For once, they actually stopped. The figure leaned closer, its presence like a soft blanket draped across the air. You found your voice. Even if it trembles, it carries truth. That is not small, Morty. That is courage. Morty closed his eyes, letting the words sink deep. He realized courage didn't always roar. It could whisper, it could stumble, it could sit at a dinner table and simply ask for silence. As the days unfolded, Morty began noticing how the figure's words wove into him in ways he couldn't untangle. They showed up in the quiet pauses, in choices that once would have paralyzed him. He wasn't suddenly fearless, but he was learning how to move through fear with softer steps. Still, a question lingered in the back of his mind, whispering louder with each act of courage. Was he leaning too much on the figure? Every word of guidance, every reassurance. What if he couldn't act without it? What if one day he was forced to stand alone? The thought frightened him, but it also challenged him. Because somewhere deep down, Morty knew the figure's presence wasn't meant to be forever. It was meant to teach him how to carry its wisdom inside himself, so that when the day came, he would no longer need to whisper to the stars for strength. He would find it within. That night, before leaving the garage, Morty looked at the figure and asked softly, "Do you think one day I'll be able to do this without you?" The figure smiled, radiant and calm. "You already are. Each step you take outside these walls proves it. The day you no longer ask that question will be the day you realize I never truly left." Morty lingered on the threshold, the words echoing in his mind as he glanced back one last time. The garage hummed with quiet light, and though he still carried doubt, there was also a new certainty blooming within him, fragile but alive. He stepped out into the night, the air cool and endless, carrying with him the beginnings of a truth he didn't yet fully understand, that the strength he sought had never been outside him, but waiting all along, patient as the stars above. The night air clung to Morty's skin as he stepped away from the garage, carrying the warmth of the figure's words like embers in his chest. The world outside felt both familiar and new. Streets he had walked 100 times now shimmered with a quiet strangeness, as if they were waiting to test what he had learned. He thought about the figure's smile, the way it had said, You already are? Those words followed him like a heartbeat, and yet they unsettled him too, because they suggested he was farther along than he believed. The next morning, the world wasted no time in pressing against him. At school, his classmates buzzed with the usual noise, laughter sharp as broken glass, whispers curling through the hallways. Morty carried himself differently now, slightly straighter, slightly steadier, but people noticed, and noticing often invited challenge. During lunch, one of the older kids, tall and careless, shoved past him hard enough to make his tray clatter to the floor. A hush swept across the cafeteria, waiting for Morty to shrink back, to let it slide as he always had. His body trembled, instincts screaming at him to retreat. But beneath that fear was something else. A memory of the boy whose food had fallen weeks ago, of the moment Morty had chosen to bend down instead of turn away. That memory anchored him. Slowly, he knelt, picked up the tray, and stood tall, not glaring, not fighting, just steady. He met the boy's eyes for a fleeting second and said, voice low but clear, "You don't have to do that." The older kid blinked, startled by the unexpected calm. He scoffed and walked away, muttering under his breath. But the crowd's laughter didn't come this time. They watched Morty instead, curious, almost unsettled. Morty's hands shook as he sat down, but something inside him steadied. It wasn't victory. It was proof that he could carry the figure's lessons into the noisy world, even when his knees wanted to buckle. That evening, Morty told the figure everything, the tremor in his voice betraying how much the moment had cost him. The figure listened without interruption, then said softly, "Courage is not the absence of shaking hands. It is choosing to hold steady even as they shake." Morty let those words wrap around him. He realized courage wasn't about silence from others or sudden admiration. It was about the small choices, the ones no one applauded, the ones that built a quiet strength beneath the skin. But as days turned into weeks, a deeper shift began to stir. Morty noticed the figure speaking less, offering fewer instructions. It no longer filled every silence with guidance. Instead, it watched, eyes kind but distant, as if waiting for him to find the words himself. At first, Morty worried it meant the figure was fading, slipping away because he no longer needed it. Panic gripped him late at night, whispering that he might lose the one presence that had never judged him. "Why aren't you talking as much?" Morty asked one evening, voice brittle with worry. "Did I do something wrong? Are you leaving?" The figure's glow softened, folding around Morty like moonlight on water. "I am listening. You are learning to hear your own voice. If I speak less, it is because you are speaking more." Morty wanted to argue, to cling tighter, but the truth of the words sank deep. He had been speaking more at school, at home, even to himself. He had begun to ask questions out loud, to challenge moments that once drowned him in silence. Maybe the figure was right. Maybe this quiet wasn't abandonment, but trust. Still, the thought of losing it haunted him. Nights stretched long as Morty lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between pride in his growth and fear of what growth demanded, because deep down, he knew growth meant moving forward, and moving forward meant letting go. The turning point came one cloudy afternoon when Morty overheard Summer arguing with a friend on the phone. Her voice cracked, words tumbling sharp with frustration. When she hung up, she sat on the couch, shoulders tense, eyes glassy though she tried to hide it. Morty hovered in the doorway, unsure. Normally he would have walked past, afraid of saying the wrong thing, but something nudged him forward, a quiet echo from the garage. He sat beside her, silent at first. Then softly he said, "I don't know what to say to make it better, but I'm here." Summer blinked, surprised, then let out a shaky laugh.
"You?
"Comforting me? That's new." But she didn't move away. She leaned back, sighing, and for a moment the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was shared. Later, Morty told the figure about it, uncertain whether it mattered. The figure's eyes glimmered with quiet pride. "You gave her presence. That is more than words. Sometimes being here is all that is needed." Morty felt something loosen in his chest. He had always thought strength meant loudness, boldness, being bigger than his fear. But maybe it was something else, something gentler, quieter, more enduring. As the chapter of his days unfolded, Morty began to see patterns forming. Each time he chose to act, no matter how small, the world shifted just a little. Not always in grand ways, but in ripples, subtle and lasting. And though the figure still lingered, he noticed he wasn't leaning as heavily. The lessons were weaving into him, no longer separate, but part of his own voice. Yet with that growth came a new ache. He began to sense the horizon of this bond, the edge of the moment when the figure would no longer be there to meet him in the garage. It didn't say it outright, but Morty felt it like the way seasons shift slowly and perceptibly until one day you realize the leaves have turned. One night, as shadows stretched long, Morty asked the question he had been avoiding. When it's time, will it hurt? When you're gone? The figure's eyes softened, shimmering like distant stars. It may ache, Morty, but ache is proof of love. And love never truly leaves. It only changes its shape. Morty's throat tightened, tears blurring his vision. He didn't want to imagine the silence of the garage, the absence of that glow. But part of him knew that one day, the lessons would have to walk with him alone. For now, though, the figure was still here. And as Morty drifted into sleep that night, he clung not to the fear of endings, but to the quiet truth that beginnings were already unfolding inside him, shaping him into someone he hadn't yet met, but was slowly becoming. The days grew heavier with a strange quiet, as if Morty's world itself sensed the shift inside him. He noticed that the figure still appeared when he entered the garage, but its glow was softer now, less urgent, as though it were no longer the center of the space, but a presence in the corner. Watching, Morty both craved and feared that change. He wanted the figure to stay, yet he couldn't deny that its silence was shaping him. The pauses it left were no longer empty. They pressed him to fill them with his own voice, his own choices. The first true test came without warning, in the kind of ordinary afternoon that usually passed unnoticed. Morty was walking home from school, backpack heavy against his shoulders, when he saw a small group of kids gathered near the park. Their laughter rang out sharp and cruel, circling around another boy standing alone. The boy's arms were crossed tight, face lowered, trying to shrink away from the jeers. Morty's stomach clenched at the sight, too familiar, too close to memories he carried like scars. For a moment he froze, his heart pounded, urging him to keep walking, to pretend he hadn't seen. That old instinct whispered that it wasn't his problem, that stepping in would only paint a target on his own back. But another voice rose inside him, quiet yet steady, echoing with the softness of the garage. Meaning does not live in size, measure by heart. Morty swallowed hard, his palms sweating, and before he could overthink, his feet moved. He stepped closer, his voice trembling but clear. Leave him alone. The laughter faltered. The group turned to him, eyes narrowing, testing him. For a breathless moment, Morty thought he'd made a mistake. His knees shook, but he stood his ground, forcing himself not to look away. He's not hurting anyone. Just stop. There was silence, thick and uncertain. Then one of the kids muttered something dismissive, rolling their eyes. Slowly they drifted off, the spell of their cruelty broken. The boy who had been standing alone looked up at Morty, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and gratitude. He whispered a small, shaky thanks before hurrying away. Morty stood there, chest tight, until the adrenaline ebbed. His whole body felt like it might collapse under the weight of what had just happened, yet at the same time he had never felt taller. He had acted not perfectly, not without fear, but he had acted. That night when he told the figure about it, his voice trembled with the memory. I thought they were gonna laugh at me too. I thought maybe they'd shove me. Or worse. But they just stopped. I don't know how, but they stopped. The figure's eyes shimmered, warm with pride. You carried the lesson into the world. You gave your fear shape, and still you chose to stand. That is strength, Morty. Not the absence of fear, but the will to act, while it breathes against your neck. Morty's throat tightened, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. For once he didn't cry out of shame or loneliness. These were tears of release, of realizing that the boy who once whispered wishes to the stars had begun to become someone else. Someone braver, someone who could be a light for others. In the days that followed, Morty noticed the shift within himself more clearly. He wasn't suddenly fearless, nor did the world grow kinder overnight. The teasing still came, the arguments at home still flared. But now he carried something that anchored him through the noise. He no longer looked only to the figure for answers. He began listening for them in his own chest, in the quiet spaces between breaths. But with that growth came a deeper ache, the awareness that the figure's time with him was growing shorter. Each evening the garage seemed quieter, the lights softer, as if it were slowly folding into the background. Morty clung to each moment, lingering longer, reluctant to leave. One night, he sat on the floor, voice barely above a whisper. If you disappear, I don't know if I'll be ready. The figure knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand over his heart as it had before. You already carry me here. If I fade, it will not be because you are alone. It will be because you have learned to see yourself. Morty wanted to believe those words, but part of him resisted, afraid that when the time came he would crumble. Still he nodded, holding the moment like a fragile treasure, afraid to let go. The weeks stretched on, each one leaving him stronger, but more aware of the quiet horizon ahead. He found himself reflecting on the boy in the park, on Summer's tired eyes, on the small acts of presence he had managed. None of them were grand, but together they formed a mosaic of something larger, a pattern of becoming. One evening, as he sat in the garage, Morty spoke without waiting for the figure to guide him. Maybe being ready doesn't mean I stop being scared. Maybe it just means I can carry it without breaking. The figure smiled, radiant and proud. Yes, Morty, that is the beginning of wisdom. In that moment, Morty realized something he hadn't before, that the figure wasn't just teaching him to be brave. It was teaching him to become the kind of presence it had been for him. Quiet, steady, a light in the dark. As he left the garage that night, the air cool against his skin, Morty didn't feel as though he was stepping away from something. For the first time, he felt he was carrying it with him, woven into the rhythm of his breath, into the way he saw the world. The stars above no longer looked so far away. They felt close, as though they too were whispering that he was enough, and that the journey was only beginning. The nights had grown quieter, and though Morty still slipped into the garage with the same nervous anticipation, he could no longer ignore the truth his companion was fading. The glow that once filled the space like starlight seemed dimmer, softer, as if the figure itself was pulling gently away from the world. Morty felt it every time their eyes met, every time its voice wrapped around him like a steady hand. It wasn't gone yet, but the distance between them was widening, invisible yet undeniable. At first, Morty tried to fight it. He lingered longer than usual, speaking faster, afraid to leave silence hanging in the air. He asked more questions, even ones he already knew the answers to, desperate to anchor the figure's presence with sound, with attention, with need. But the figure only smiled with that same serene patience, answering when necessary, listening when Morty stumbled into spirals of doubt. One evening, Morty blurted out the fear he could no longer swallow. "You're leaving me, aren't you?" His voice cracked on the words, small and raw. The figure's eyes shone with a tenderness that felt almost like sorrow. "Leaving is not the right word. I am not walking away from you, Morty. I am simply becoming part of what is already inside you. The more you grow, the less you will need me here." Morty shook his head, gripping his knees tightly. "But I do need you. Every time things feel heavy, every time I think I can't take another step, you're the one who makes it okay. Without you, it'll all just come crashing back." The figure leaned closer, its glow brushing his skin like a gentle warmth. "It will not crash, Morty, because you have carried every moment of this with you. The courage you showed, the kindness you offered, the strength you found when you thought there was none. It was you. I only reminded you to look." Morty's chest ached with the weight of those words. He wanted to argue, to insist that he wasn't enough, that the figure was the real reason he had made it this far. But deep down beneath the fear, a quieter truth pressed against him. Part of him had changed. He could no longer deny the boy in the park, the times he had faced his fears, the nights he had spoken his heart without crumbling. Those moments were not borrowed. They were his. Still, the thought of losing this guiding presence was unbearable. That night, Morty fell asleep with the words heavy in his mind, dreaming of a world where the garage was empty, where he searched and searched but found nothing but silence. He woke with tears drying on his face. Days passed, and with each one, the figure's glow dimmed just a little more. Morty noticed it most when he spoke of his day, how instead of long answers, the figure sometimes offered only a nod or a question that turned the reflection back on him. It was subtle, but Morty understood. The figure was teaching him to carry the dialogue alone. One evening, after a particularly hard day at school, Morty sat in the garage in silence. He had been shoved in the hallway, his books scattered, laughter echoing around him. The old shame returned. The old sting of humiliation. His instinct had been to run home, to collapse into the comfort of the figure's presence. But now, as he looked across the room, he saw it waiting, not to solve, not to soothe, but to see what he would do. "I hated it," Morty whispered, his voice trembling. "I hated feeling small again, like I was nothing. For a second, I thought maybe I hadn't changed at all." He paused, the words sticking in his throat. Then he forced them out, slow but firm. "But I remembered what you told me, that fear doesn't mean I'm weak. And I picked up my books. My hands were shaking, but I picked them up. I walked away, and I didn't cry this time." The figure's smile deepened, though its glow flickered faintly. "That was strength, Morty, not in defeating them, but in choosing not to let their cruelty undo you." Tears filled Morty's eyes, but they were not the same kind as before. He wiped them quickly, ashamed of showing too much. Yet when he looked back, the figure was watching him with nothing but pride. In the nights that followed, Morty began speaking more to himself. At first it felt strange, as though he were practicing lines in front of a mirror. But soon he realized he was no longer waiting for answers. He was giving them. He caught himself whispering reassurances, offering his own thoughts where once he would have waited for guidance. It frightened him, this slow independence, because it meant the figure's fading was real, but it also gave him a fragile kind of hope. The final turning point came on a night when the stars seemed unusually sharp against the dark sky. Morty sat in the garage, heart heavy, knowing somehow that this would be different. The figure was there, but its light was faint, like a candle nearing its end. Morty's throat tightened. "Please," he whispered, "don't go yet. I'm not ready." The figure reached out, placing one last gentle hand over Morty's heart. The warmth was weaker now, but steady. "You are more ready than you know. You will stumble. Yes. You will doubt. Yes. But listen here." It pressed softly against his chest. "You already carry the light. When you cannot see me, you will still feel me. In every breath, in every step you take forward, I will remain." Morty broke, tears spilling freely as he clutched at the figure's fading form. "I don't want to forget you." "You won't," the figure said, voice like a final song. "Because you are me, Morty, and I am you. You are never alone." The glow flickered once more, bright for a fleeting heartbeat, and then began to dissolve into the air around him, like starlight scattering into the night. Morty reached out, desperate to hold on, but his hands closed on nothing. The garage was still, quiet, empty. For a long time he sat frozen, listening to the silence, his chest hollow. Yet beneath the ache, there was a pulse steady, sure, alive. His hand pressed against his heart, and he felt it warmth, lingering, not gone, but transformed. He breathed in, shaky yet full, and for the first time he believed the figure's words. He was not the same boy who had once whispered wishes to the stars. He was something more now, carrying a piece of that light inside him, and though the nights ahead would be dark, he would walk them knowing he no longer had to search for the glow. He was learning to become it. The first few nights without the figure were the hardest. The garage felt emptier than Morty thought possible, like a once vivid dream that had been washed pale by the morning light. He sat in the same spot as always, waiting, half hoping the glow would flicker back into being. But there was only silence and the hum of machines left behind by Rick's careless tinkering. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow deeper, and Morty realized how much he had leaned on the quiet presence that was now gone. At school, the absence was even louder. Morty caught himself glancing to the side, expecting reassurance when his chest tightened, only to find no one there. The first time a teacher called on him, his throat closed up and his palms dampened. For a heartbeat, he nearly folded back into the boy he used to be. But then, almost instinctively, he heard an echo. Not the figure's voice exactly, but something like it. Softer, internal. "You already carry the light." The words steadied him like a hand pressed gently to his shoulder. He cleared his throat, stumbled through the answer. And though his voice shook, he finished. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And it was enough. Days stretched into weeks, each one a quiet test. Morty began to see how much of his world was built on small acts of courage, not grand victories. He helped a kid in the hallway pick up scattered papers, and though his hands trembled, he didn't rush away afterward. He tried speaking up at dinner, not waiting for Rick's chaos or Beth's distracted nods to cover his silence. Sometimes he faltered, sometimes he wished the figure were still there to guide him, but every attempt left a faint glow inside, proof that the lessons had rooted themselves deep. Yet with growth came loneliness. At night, when the house settled into sleep, Morty would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, longing for the quiet companionship he had lost. He whispered into the dark, asking questions with no one to answer them. The ache of it was heavy, but slowly he began to notice something else. The silence itself was becoming softer. It wasn't the hollow emptiness he had feared. It was space. Space where his own thoughts could breathe, where his heart could speak without interruption. One night, instead of waiting for the figure to appear, Morty whispered to himself, "I'm proud of you." The words felt clumsy, almost embarrassing, but when he repeated them, they began to carry weight. He felt the warmth spread in his chest, faint and fragile, but real. For the first time, he understood what the figure had meant. He was learning to be both the question and the answer. It was during this time that Morty's bond with his family began to shift, subtly but unmistakably. Summer noticed first. One evening, after Morty offered her the last slice of pizza without hesitation, she raised an eyebrow. "You're different lately," she said, not unkindly. Morty shrugged, muttering something about just trying to be decent, but inside he felt a ripple of pride. Beth noticed too, though in quieter ways. She looked at him longer across the dinner table as if surprised by the steadiness in his eyes. Rick, of course, teased him mercilessly, tossing jabs about Morty becoming soft or philosophical. Yet beneath the mocking, Morty thought he caught a flicker of respect, rare and fleeting. But there, still the hardest relationship to face was with himself. There were nights when doubt surged, when he felt small again, overwhelmed by the noise of the world. He would close his eyes and imagine the garage filled with light, wishing desperately for the figure's return. But then he remembered the figure wasn't gone. It had folded into him, and if he searched, not with his eyes but with his breath, he could find it. On one of these nights, as he sat by his bedroom window, Morty whispered aloud, "I miss you." His voice cracked, honest and raw. A tear slid down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, soft as rain. Then he pressed his hand to his chest and whispered again, "But I'm trying, I'm really trying." The silence answered, not with sound, but with calm. A quiet acceptance settled over him, gentle and steady. And though the room was empty, Morty felt less alone. As weeks turned to months, Morty began to notice patterns. Every time he faced fear and chose to step forward, the ache of loss eased just a little. Every time he offered kindness, even in small, unnoticed ways, he felt the glow flicker inside him. It was not the same as before. It was not as immediate, not as comforting, but it was his, and it was growing. One afternoon, while walking home from school, Morty paused at the park, the same park where he had once sat, clutching fear like a heavy stone. He looked at the trees, the swings swaying gently in the breeze, and remembered the boy who had first longed for guidance. That boy still lived inside him, fragile and uncertain, but now he was joined by someone steadier, someone who had walked through the shadows and learned to find light. Sitting on the bench, Morty whispered into the open air, "I'm not the same anymore." The wind stirred cool and soft against his skin, almost like a reply. He smiled faintly, tears threatening but not spilling. For the first time, the thought of being alone did not terrify him. It felt natural, like the figure's absence was not a loss, but a transformation. As twilight settled, painting the sky in fading gold, Morty stood and walked home with a quiet certainty in his step. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead. Rick's chaos, school's cruelty, the world's indifference, but he carried something new now. Not just the memory of a guiding presence, but the living proof that he could be his own. And though the nights were still long, Morty no longer searched for the glow in the garage. He carried it with him, in his heart, steady and alive. Morty didn't realize how fragile his newfound steadiness was until the world decided to test it. For a while, carrying the glow within him felt enough. He could whisper strength to himself, push through the smaller cruelties, and walk with a quietness that was different from before. But the real challenges came not in silence or solitude, but in the moments when others pushed against him, when the world pressed so heavily that even the strongest heart could falter. It began one afternoon at school. A group of older kids, the same kind who had laughed at him for years, cornered him in the hallway. They didn't need a reason. They never did. Their words were sharp, designed to pierce and scatter whatever confidence he had gathered. Morty felt the sting, as deeply as ever. The tight throat, the trembling hands, the desire to shrink until he disappeared. For a moment, he almost gave in to the old instinct to run. But then faintly he heard it again. That soft echo, the memory of a voice. "You already carry the light." So he stood. He didn't fight back, didn't throw words or fists, but he also didn't fold. He looked him in the eyes, voice trembling but steady enough to say, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was enough to surprise them, enough to keep him standing long after they walked away, muttering insults that suddenly carried less weight. Morty's heart pounded, his legs shook, but when it was over, he knew something had shifted. The glow inside him had held. That night, however, the doubt crept in. Lying in bed, Morty replayed every second, every word he wished he had said differently, every fear that maybe he had only embarrassed himself more. The loneliness returned, sharp and hollow, and he whispered into the dark, "I wish you were still here." His voice cracked, and for a long time he just listened to the silence. But then, slowly, he placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "You're still here. You're still here." The warmth that rose wasn't as strong as before, but it was real enough to soothe him into sleep. The days that followed wove a strange rhythm. Moments of strength braided with moments of fragility. Morty began noticing how much he leaned on small rituals to steady himself. Sitting by the window before bed, breathing deeply under the stars, pausing in the garage, not to search for the figure, but to remember the glow it once left behind. Even small things, like choosing kindness when no one was watching, reminded him of the lessons he had inherited. Each act was a quiet anchor, a way of saying, I am still carrying it. But growth was never smooth. Some evenings the weight of it all pressed too heavily. One particular night, Rick had stumbled and drunk and dismissed Morty's attempt at a question with cruel laughter. The old shame rushed back, heavy and suffocating, and Morty retreated to his room with tears burning his eyes. He sat on the floor, knees pulled close, whispering to himself that he wasn't weak, that he had changed. But the words felt hollow, brittle. For the first time in months, he wondered if he had only imagined it all. If the glow was just a dream he had wanted too badly to believe. Yet in that breaking, something surprising happened. Summer knocked softly on his door. You okay? She asked through the wood, her voice carrying a tenderness that Morty hadn't expected. He almost said nothing, almost stayed silent, but instead he whispered back, not really. The pause on the other side stretched, then her voice came, soft and sure. Yeah, me too. It wasn't guidance, not wisdom, not the same comfort he had once leaned on, but it was human. It was real, and in that moment, Morty realized the glow didn't have to come only from within. It could also live in the connections he nurtured. From then on, Morty began to open more gently to those around him. With Summer, he shared fragments of his thoughts. With Beth, he offered patience instead of silence when she seemed distracted. Even with Rick, he learned to stand a little straighter, to let the old man's chaos wash over him without drowning. Each act was small, but together they wove something stronger. A web of belonging that supported the fragile light inside him. One evening, Morty returned to the park where everything had begun. The air was cool, the trees whispering softly, and he sat on the same bench where he had once begged for guidance. This time, he didn't plead. He didn't whisper for something to appear. He simply breathed, watching the sky fade from gold to blue to deep night. I'm still here, he said aloud, his voice steady, and I think I'm okay. The wind stirred, gentle and calm, brushing against his skin like a familiar hand. Morty closed his eyes, smiling faintly. He no longer needed the glow to appear. He no longer needed the voice to speak, because the lessons lived on, steady and alive, woven into his very being. As the stars blinked awake above him, Morty felt something new. Not just survival, not just the fragile strength of holding on, but the beginning of something larger, a purpose he didn't yet understand. A path he couldn't yet see. It was quiet, a seed buried deep, but it pulsed with the same warmth that had once guided him. And though he still missed the figure with a sharp ache, he no longer feared the silence it left behind. For the silence had become something else entirely, a space where he could grow, where the boy he had been could slowly shape into someone new. He rose from the bench, hands tucked in his pockets, heart carrying both the ache and the light. The night was wide, mysterious, and uncertain, but Morty walked into it with the quiet strength of someone who had learned that even in the darkest moments, the glow would always remain. Morty carried the memory of that night at the park like a secret ember, small but steady, glowing quietly whenever the world pressed against him. The ember didn't erase his fear or loneliness, but it gave him something he had never truly felt before, a sense that he could endure. And as days turned to weeks, that quiet endurance began to ripple outward, touching others in ways Morty hadn't intended, almost like the glow within him was finding paths beyond his own heart. It began with simple gestures. One morning, as Morty rushed to class, he noticed a younger kid struggling to open a heavy door. Normally, he might have slipped past, too afraid of drawing attention, but something inside him urged him to pause. He held the door, offered a small smile, and for a brief moment, he saw the kid's shoulders lift, just a little lighter. It was nothing grand, barely a flicker in the rhythm of the day. But as Morty walked away, he realized his own chest felt warmer. The glow was not diminished by giving. It was multiplied. The pattern continued in unexpected ways. He listened when a classmate rambled nervously about a failed test, nodding instead of retreating. He sat with Summer one evening when she was unusually quiet, neither of them needing to fill the silence. Even Beth, distracted by the weight of her own life, seemed to soften when Morty met her tired eyes with steady patience instead of sulking withdrawal. These moments did not erase the chaos of Rick's experiments, the cruelty of peers, or the ache that still lingered from losing the figure. But they wove threads of connection, fragile yet luminous, as if the light within him was learning how to spill into the lives of others. Morty wasn't always graceful about it. Sometimes he stumbled, offering kindness clumsily, or at the wrong time, and shame would creep in like a shadow. But instead of drowning in it, he began to remind himself that even imperfect attempts had meaning. The glow inside him was not about perfection. It was about presence, about showing up even when his hands shook. One night, as he sat by his window, Morty whispered into the dark, I think I get it now. It's not just about me, is it? It's about what I carry forward. The words felt heavier than usual, like a truth that had been waiting for him to speak it aloud. He remembered the figure's final promise that it would remain in him, shaping not just his path but the way he touched the world. And yet, with this understanding came fear. What if he wasn't strong enough? What if his small gestures weren't enough to matter? Morty felt the doubts coil in his chest, sharp and insistent. But then he remembered how the figure had never demanded greatness, never asked him to be extraordinary. It had only asked him to try, to live with gentleness, even when the world was not gentle with him. That realization settled over him like a blanket. The ember glowed a little brighter. The true test came unexpectedly. One rainy afternoon, Morty noticed the same younger kid from before, sitting alone on the steps outside the school, head bowed, backpack drenched. The boy's face was red, his eyes wet with tears. He was trying to hide. Morty hesitated, fear tugging at him. What if he said the wrong thing? What if his presence only made it worse? But then he remembered the bench at the park, the figure's voice reminding him that even silence could be a gift. So Morty sat down beside the boy without a word. The rain fell softly, soaking through his clothes, but he didn't move. After a while, the boy glanced at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. Morty offered a small, crooked smile, nothing more. They sat like that until the tears slowed, until the boy's breathing evened. No speeches, no solutions, just presence. When the boy finally whispered thanks, Morty felt the ember flare. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And in that moment, he understood that the light was not meant to be locked inside him. It was meant to be shared. Quietly, gently, in ways that might never be remembered, but would always matter. That night, Morty returned to the garage. The emptiness was still there, but it no longer hurt in the same way. He stood in the silence and whispered, "I'm doing it. I think I'm really doing it." For a heartbeat, he thought he felt warmth brush his skin, like an unseen hand resting gently on his shoulder. He closed his eyes, smiling through the tears that rose. The figure might be gone, but its legacy lived in every choice Morty made. Every flicker of kindness that stretched beyond himself. As the weeks passed, Morty found himself watching the world differently. He noticed the subtle cracks in people's armor, the way Summer laughed too loudly when she was hurting, the way Beth stared at the floor when no one was speaking, the way strangers carried invisible burdens in their hunched shoulders. He couldn't fix these things, but he could be present, and somehow being present felt like enough. On quiet nights, Morty still whispered into the dark, sometimes to the figure, sometimes to himself. The words shifted with time, from "I miss you" to "I'm trying to, I see now," and always beneath them, the ember glowed. Morty had once believed that light was something you searched for outside yourself, something to be given by another. Now he understood it differently. Light was both a gift and a responsibility. It was something you carried, nurtured, and shared in the smallest of ways. As autumn deepened and the air grew colder, Morty walked home beneath a sky thick with stars. He tilted his head back, breathing in the night, and whispered, "I think this is what you wanted me to learn." The stars shimmered faintly, distant yet present, and Morty felt the answer, not in sound, but in the steady warmth of his chest. The boy who had once begged for a guide was becoming something new, a quiet source of light, not flawless, not unbreakable, but steady in his own fragile way. And though he didn't know what the future would bring, he carried a certainty with him. Whatever came next, the glow would endure. The weeks blended into one another, carrying Morty forward like a quiet current. Each day, he walked with that hidden glow within him, a lantern no one else could see, and yet its presence shaped the way he moved through the world. He began to realize that the ember wasn't simply for survival anymore. It was guiding him towards something larger, something he had only begun to glimpse. The small acts of presence and kindness he'd offered had not gone unnoticed. Though he wasn't seeking acknowledgement, instead, they rippled outward in ways that returned to him unexpectedly, as if the universe itself was weaving his choices back into his path. One afternoon in the middle of class, a girl who rarely spoke leaned over and whispered, "Thanks for sitting with my brother that day. He told me you helped." Morty froze, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't thought of it as helping, only as being there, but hearing the words filled him with a strange mixture of humility and wonder. His chest tightened. Not with pride, but with the dawning awareness that even the smallest gestures left echoes. Perhaps this was the figure's lesson all along, that nothing was too small to matter. The thought lingered with him, circling in his mind as days passed. He began to notice how his own light responded to the world around him, how it burned brighter when he reached outward, dimmer when he retreated into fear, and though the old doubts still returned, whispering that he wasn't enough, the ember always remained. It was steady, patient, waiting for him to trust it fully. One evening, Morty found himself back at the park. The bench where he had once sat with the figure looked weathered, its wood darkened by rain and time, but it stood unmoved. He lowered himself onto it, tracing his hand across the rough grain, and for a moment, memory and reality seemed to overlap. He could almost hear the figure's voice again, quiet and unhurried. Morty closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him, the same way the figure's presence once had. But when he opened them, something felt different. The air seemed charged, not with the weight of grief, but with possibility. He realized that coming here was not about clinging to what was lost. It was about carrying forward what remained. The bench wasn't a shrine. It was a reminder that even fleeting presences could leave permanent imprints. That night, Morty dreamed. In the dream, he stood in a vast, starlit field, the kind where the horizon felt endless. The figure was there, but not as before. Its shape was less distinct, its edges blurred, like it was no longer separate from the stars themselves. Morty didn't speak at first, afraid that any sound would shatter the fragile moment. But then the figure's voice, soft as wind, rose around him. "You've done well, Morty. The light isn't mine anymore. It's yours." Morty's throat tightened. But what if I mess it up? What if I can't keep it burning? The figure stepped closer, though its form flickered like smoke against the night. Light isn't about never faltering. It's about returning, again and again, even when it dims, even when it feels lost. It waits for you to find it, and you always will. Morty wanted to reach out, but when he lifted his hand, the figure dissolved into the stars. He gasped, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that the figure had not left. It had merged with everything. The stars, the night, the quiet glow in his chest. When he awoke, his pillow was damp with tears, but his heart felt steadier than it had in a long time. In the days that followed, Morty began to sense a shift within himself. He wasn't just reacting to the world anymore, he was beginning to shape how he moved through it. The glow gave him courage to speak up when someone was cruel, not with anger but with firmness. It gave him patience when Rick dragged him into dangerous experiments, reminding him to hold on to his center even in chaos. It gave him the strength to sit with his own loneliness without letting it swallow him whole. And slowly he began to see how others responded. His classmates looked at him differently, not as the awkward boy who stumbled over words, but as someone steady, someone safe to lean on. Summer rolled her eyes less and started lingering in conversations with him. Even Beth, worn down by her own struggles, seemed to soften when Morty quietly listened instead of demanding answers. These weren't dramatic changes, but they mattered. They were proof that his light was not just sustaining him, it was touching the lives around him, shaping them in subtle but real ways. One night, Morty stood at his window again, gazing out at the stars. He thought about the figure, about the dream, about the way the stars had seemed alive. He whispered, "I think I understand now. You didn't just give me light. You showed me that I am light, and maybe that means I was never truly alone." The words settled into the night, soft but certain. Morty didn't need an answer this time. He felt it in the warmth of his chest, in the steady rhythm of his breath, in the quiet courage that now lived inside him. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be nights of doubt, days when the glow felt faint, moments when he stumbled under the weight of his own fear. But he also knew something he hadn't before. He could always return to the ember, no matter how dim it seemed, and in returning he could carry it forward into himself, into others, into the unknown paths ahead. The boy who once begged for guidance was becoming something more, not because he no longer needed help, but because he had learned to carry the essence of it within him. The figure's presence was no longer a memory bound to the past. It was alive in Morty's choices, in his voice, in the way he showed up for others. And as he stood there, the night stretching infinite around him, Morty realized that his story was no longer only about survival. It was about becoming a beacon, not brilliant or unshakable, but quietly steadfast, a light others could glimpse and remember when their own nights felt too heavy. The ember was no longer just a gift. It was a calling, and Morty, with trembling but determined hands, was learning to answer it. Morty carried the weight of the figure's words with a new kind of steadiness. The nights no longer seemed as empty, and the glow within him had grown into a companion he trusted. Yet with each passing day, he sensed that the ember had not revealed its full purpose. It wasn't just about survival or quiet acts of kindness. It was preparing him for something heavier. Something that would test not only his strength but his faith in the very light he had come to rely on. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to step forward into the unknown trial. It began subtly, as most changes do. Rick had been working on a new invention, his muttering more frantic than usual, his hands trembling slightly as if even he knew the stakes were higher than normal. Morty had learned not to question too much. Rick never gave full answers, only riddles wrapped in science, but this time felt different. The machine pulsed with energy that made the hairs on Morty's arms stand straight. A strange hum followed him long after he left the garage, echoing faintly inside his chest as if resonating with the glow itself. That night, Morty woke from a dream that was sharper, more vivid than the others. The starlit field returned, but this time the sky was split in two. One side shimmered with light, steady and warm. The other churned with shadows, alive and restless. The figure was gone. In its place, a vast shape stirred in the darkness, its eyes glinting with hunger, its voice a low whisper. "Your light is fragile. Let me take it from you, and the struggle will end." Morty clutched his chest, feeling the ember flicker in response. The temptation was immediate and sharp. To surrender meant release from the weight of responsibility, from the fear of failing, from the burden of carrying something he still barely understood. For a moment he wavered, but then, like a distant echo, the figure's words returned. Light isn't about never faltering. It's about returning again and again. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as though he had fought a battle in his sleep. In the days that followed, Morty began to notice shadows curling at the edges of places they didn't belong. Hallways stretched longer than they should have. Corners seemed darker. Whispers drifted from nowhere. Rick dismissed it all as Morty's nerves, but Morty knew better. The shadows weren't external. They were drawn to the ember inside him, feeding on his doubt, waiting for the chance to smother what he carried. The true test arrived when Rick's machine malfunctioned. The garage doors shuddered, sparks rained from the ceiling, and a fissure opened in the air, tearing reality into jagged edges of light and dark. From the rift spilled the same darkness Morty had seen in his dream. Tendrils of shadow stretching across the floor like searching fingers. Rick cursed and scrambled for tools, but Morty could only stare, frozen as the glow in his chest pulsed in frantic response. The shadows weren't just random, they were coming for him. His first instinct was to run. His body screamed to flee, to let Rick handle it, to deny that the test had arrived. But something deeper held him still. If he ran, the shadows would follow. If he hid, the ember would dim. He had no choice but to face it. The darkness rose taller, shaping itself into a form both alien and eerily familiar. Its voice slithered into his mind. The same one from his dream. "You don't belong to the light, Morty. You are small, weak, afraid. Give in, and the weight will fall away." Morty trembled, every word sinking like poison, feeding the insecurities he had carried for so long. He thought of the times he had failed Rick, of the nights he had cried quietly into his pillow, of the endless feeling of not being enough. The ember flickered wildly, dimming under the assault. For a moment, he almost believed the darkness was right. But then memories rose to the surface. Summer's softened voice, Beth's weary gratitude, the quiet thanks from the girl at school, the figure's steady presence. Each memory was a spark, small but insistent. Morty closed his eyes and drew them close, letting the ember feed on them instead of his fear. When he opened his eyes, the glow in his chest had steadied. His voice, though trembling, carried through the garage. "I may be small, I may be afraid, but that doesn't mean I don't matter. This light, it's not just mine. It's every person who's ever needed hope, and I won't let you take it." The shadows recoiled as if burned, their tendrils snapping back, hissing against the radiance now spilling from Morty. The ember flared outward, no longer contained, wrapping him in a shield of pale fire. The darkness lunged, but every strike dissolved before reaching him, swallowed by the light. Rick glanced up from his frantic work, his eyes widening, but he said nothing, perhaps too stunned to process what was unfolding before him. The battle raged like a storm, shadows pressing harder, Morty's light straining but refusing to break. Every time doubt returned, he felt the ember waver, but he remembered the figure's words and steadied himself. Returning again and again, it was not about perfection, it was about persistence, about choosing the light over and over, even when fear screamed louder. Finally, with a cry that tore from the deepest part of him, Morty thrust his hands forward. The ember surged, exploding into a wave of brilliance that flooded the garage, pushing back the shadows, sealing the rift, and leaving behind only silence. Morty collapsed to his knees, trembling, his breath ragged, but the ember pulsed stronger than ever, its glow steady and unwavering. Rick finally spoke, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Morty, what the hell was that?" Morty didn't have an answer, not one Rick would accept. Anyway, all he could do was press a hand to his chest, where the warmth still radiated, and whisper, more to himself than anyone, It was me. That night, as he lay in bed, Morty understood. The figure had given him a gift. Yes, but the true test was never about receiving. It was about choosing the light when it would be easier to surrender. Choosing hope when fear clawed for control. Choosing to carry forward not just for himself, but for everyone who needed even a flicker to guide them through their own darkness. He had passed the test, though he knew others would come. The ember had not only survived, it had grown, matured into a flame he could trust. And with that realization, Morty finally drifted into sleep, not as a boy clutching borrowed light, but as someone who had begun to make it his own. The night after Morty had faced the shadows felt strangely still, as if the very air had quieted in recognition of what he had endured. The ember inside him no longer flickered uncertainly. It glowed with a steady warmth, not overwhelming but persistent, like a lantern carried through endless dusk. He lay awake longer than usual, staring at the faint patterns of light and shadow on his ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his own breath, trying to make sense of the way everything seemed both familiar and utterly transformed. He knew the trial was over, yet he also understood something deeper. Light once kindled does not remain unchanged. It leaves traces on the world, on the people who glimpse it, on the heart that carries it. Morning arrived without fanfare. Rick moved about the kitchen with his usual muttering and careless movements, pouring coffee, dropping tools on the counter, his gruff presence unchanged on the surface. But Morty noticed small details, the way Rick's gaze lingered on him a moment longer than before, the almost imperceptible pause before Rick looked away. No words were spoken, but Morty understood. Rick had seen the light, even if he pretended not to. Some part of him respected it, maybe even trusted it, and that in itself was a quiet legacy, one Morty never expected to earn. The days slipped into a rhythm again, but everything felt tinted with meaning. At school, the whispers of mockery that once stung now seemed faint, powerless against the warmth Morty carried within. Summer, sharp as ever, began asking him questions she hadn't before. Not about his light, which she couldn't see, but about how he managed to keep steady when things felt overwhelming. Morty didn't always have the right words, but he answered honestly, in fragments and pauses, and she listened. That too was a reflection of what the ember had taught him, that small acts of honesty, shared at the right moment, could ripple farther than he realized. Biff, often worn from her own battles, began to notice the shift in him as well. One evening, she sat with him in the living room, both of them saying little. She finally whispered, almost to herself, "You've grown, Morty. I don't know how, but you've grown." He didn't reply, but the ember pulsed softly, as though acknowledging her words. The light wasn't meant to be explained. It was meant to be felt quietly, in spaces like these. Even Jerry, fumbling and often unnoticed, began to soften in Morty's eyes. Morty saw in him a man carrying his own small ember. Though dim and hidden under layers of doubt, it wasn't his place to fix it, but Morty no longer viewed his father with disdain. Instead, he held a quiet compassion, as if understanding that every person carried their own hidden battles, their own unsteady lights. The world seemed fuller, richer, when viewed this way. Yet the greatest reflection came at night, when Morty walked alone under the stars. The sky stretched above him, vast and endless, and he remembered the dream field, the figure, the whispers of doubt, and the test he had passed. He realized now that the gift wasn't meant to shield him forever. It was meant to be shared, not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments. A smile when someone felt unseen, a kind word when silence would have been easier, a hand extended, even if trembling. That was how the light lived on, how it grew, how it became something larger than himself. And still, he wondered about the figure who had given him the ember. Did they watch from afar? Did they know what had become of their gift? Or perhaps the figure was never separate from him at all. Perhaps it had always been a part of him, waiting to be awakened. The answer didn't matter as much as it once had. What mattered was the knowing that the ember was real, and that it would remain as long as he chose to nurture it. Time blurred in a dreamlike way, days folding into weeks, seasons shifting softly. The ember did not demand anything from him, yet it shaped his choices. It guided his steps toward kindness, pulled him back from despair, reminded him in whispers that even in silence, he was never alone. When fears rose again, and they did, often he no longer feared the flicker. He knew now that the test of light was not perfection, but persistence. And that was a lesson he carried gently, like a lullaby hummed under his breath. Rick, in his own way, left hints of acknowledgement. He built new machines, some reckless, some brilliant, but occasionally Morty noticed adjustments. Tiny, almost invisible changes that seemed designed to protect Morty more than himself. Rick would never say it aloud, but Morty didn't need him to. The bond between them had deepened into something quieter, a thread woven through silences, stronger than words. The final night of this chapter of Morty's journey came without announcement. He found himself lying awake again, but this time there was no fear, no restlessness. Only a calm awareness of everything he had endured, everything he had become. He thought of the first night, the strange wish that had seemed so small, and how it had led to this path of light and trial and quiet strength. He thought of the Meeseeks, of fleeting laughter, of the shadows that had almost consumed him, of the figure whose voice still lingered faintly in his dreams. And he thought of himself, not as the boy who once begged the stars for more, but as someone who now carried a piece of that starlight within him. The legacy was not dramatic. It was not carved in stone, or sung in songs. It lived in soft echoes, in family bonds a little stronger, in friendships a little warmer, in the simple act of continuing forward. Morty understood that one day, the ember would pass on, not extinguished, but transformed, carried into others, into stories, into moments that might one day guide someone else through their own darkness. As he closed his eyes, a final thought brushed across his mind, gentle and unhurried, that perhaps every wish, no matter how doomed it once seemed, held within it a seed of light, waiting for the right heart to nurture it. And with that, he drifted into sleep, the glow within him steady, the night around him soft, the stars above whispering faintly as if in gratitude. And somewhere, perhaps in a quiet corner of the universe, that wish still lingers, like a star refusing to fade. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man.